Roberto and I were happy too, although one or two dark clouds hovered on the horizon. I worried about money. The allowance I had from the divorce settlement for me and Julian didn't go far. We needed another income, but Roberto's earnings were unpredictable. He had an allowance from his father, who'd had a soft spot for him ever since Roberto had had polio as a child. And he also managed his father's London restaurant in Victoria. But all too often his money disappeared on the good things in life, before it could be used to pay bills. Roberto loved to party and was very generous. He would invite people to the restaurant and treat them all, or bring crowds back to our house and ply them with food and drink until the early hours. Still, Roberto was a kind, loving man, and I was sure that any problems we had could be sorted out. We married on July the 31st, 1970, at Kensington Registry Office. We invited our families, plus a few close friends, including Ringo and Maureen, and Twiggy, with her manager boyfriend Justin de Villeneuve. I'd have loved my old friend Phil to be there, but she was living in Cumbria and had 2 small children. Julian was our page. He hopped up and down with excitement throughout the ceremony, as my mother tried to restrain him. We went on honeymoon to Italy's Adriatic coast and one of the Bassanini hotels, taking Julian with us and my brother Charles's ex-girlfriend Katie to look after him. A couple of months after the wedding, we had a party at home, as a belated housewarming. After a lot of thought, I agreed with Roberto's suggestion that we invite John and Yoko, in an effort to build a better relationship with them. Roberto had always been in awe of John, and even though he disapproved of the way John had treated me, he was still impressed that I had been married to a Beatle and keen to meet him. I was surprised when John and Yoko agreed to come, and even more so when they turned up on the night. It was the first time I'd seen them since the ghastly meeting at the lawyer's office 2 years earlier, and I was nervous. Maureen and Ringo were also at the party, with Twiggy, Justin, Lulu and her new husband Morris Gibb, Roger Moore and his wife Louisa. John and Yoko arrived late, and an awkward couple of hours followed. After a cool hi to me, John went to sit with Ringo, Roberto joined them, and the three were soon engaged in animated conversation, punctuated by guffaws of laughter. Meanwhile, Julian, wildly excited to see his mother and father in the same room again, ran round in frenzied circles. Yoko, left out on a limb, made a beeline for me. I had sat down for a break after a couple of hours, circulating among the guests, only to find her on the floor at my feet. I was almost speechless as she chatted about Julian and how much they loved having him to visit. It was hard to reconcile this cheerful outpouring with the silent stonewalling I had received from her at our 2 previous meetings. For me, it felt like a performance, put on for the benefit of the other guests, John in particular, and I couldn't stomach it. I got up and left the room, and a few minutes later, as they departed, John spoke his second word to me that evening, bye. After they'd gone, I was sad but relieved. It had been strange and painful to see John again. I had hoped we might talk about Julian, but he had avoided me altogether, and Yoko's exaggerated attempt at being friendly had been insufferable. In the end, nothing had been gained by inviting them, except that Roberto's wish to meet the great John Lennon had been granted. Not that Roberto ever stopped disapproving of John and Yoko's behaviour. He despised Yoko and never forgave her for the hurt he believed she had caused Julian. The Beatles had continued to be a phenomenon to the end of the decade, but by mid-1969 it was clear that the end was in sight. It was around that time that John had told the other Beatles he was breaking up the group, prompted apparently by chaos at Apple. But there was a more important factor in the breakup, John's relationship with Yoko. It had infuriated and alienated the other 3 Beatles. From the beginning there had been an unwritten agreement that wives and girlfriends would never be allowed to interfere with the band's work. We often turned up at the end of recording sessions to hear the finished version, but we knew the boys worked best when they were left to get on with it. It was the way they'd always preferred things. Few people had ever been involved in recording sessions apart from the boys and George Martin. Even Brian was encouraged to stay away and wait for the finished product. Making music was work, and they worked best without anyone hanging around. When John got together with Yoko, this changed. He refused to do anything without her. He'd already announced that their names would be joined and they'd be known as John and Yoko. Then changed his middle name from Winston to Ono, all of which the other Beatles regarded with tolerant good humour. He was wacky, but we loved him anyway, was how Ringo once put it to me. When John began to bring Yoko to recording sessions and consult her about everything he did there, even allowing her to criticise what they were doing, it was too much for the others. They hated it, and it was clear that the arrangement wouldn't last amicably for long. Ultimately, of course, it was John who broke up the Beatles, just as he had formed them in the first place. He had moved on in his life, not just from me, but from Paul, the other person who was closest to him throughout the 60s. Yoko had replaced me as John's wife, and Paul as his artistic collaborator. Of course, change is inevitable, and both John and Paul went on to be creative and successful separately. But the way it happened was sad, and it was sadder still that their relationship never really healed. After 6 years of unparalleled success, the greatest band of all splintered amid a welter of acrimony and accusations. Meanwhile, John and Yoko made headlines in their quest for world peace, and I couldn't help feeling media attention. They launched their Plastic Ono band, whose first single, Give Peace a Chance, was a huge hit. They put up posters in 11 cities around the world reading, "War is over if you want it," "Happy Christmas from John and Yoko," then cut off their hair and auctioned it for peace. I know that to many people John's behaviour during that period seemed brave, honest and innovative, but as the mother of his confused small son, it was hard to see it like that. Along with many other people who loved John, his family and friends, I looked on with dismay as his actions appeared increasingly self-obsessed, and he spared little thought for the feelings of those who had once been closest to him. He seemed so intense and took himself deadly seriously too, which wasn't the John I had known, and many of his old friends and family felt the same. In September 1971, I learned from newspaper reports that John and Yoko had gone to live in the States. They had had enough of the British press and public's hatred of Yoko. This was staggering. It was only a few weeks since John had seen Julian. Yet now he was leaving the country indefinitely, without a word to me or to his son. I had no idea whether he planned to see Julian again, or how we would make contact. Until now, arrangements had been made through Peter Brown in the office, but when I spoke to him, he said he too had no idea what was going on. It seemed that John was willing to sacrifice his son to protect Yoko. It was 3 years before John saw Julian again.